Hello everyone. So Brian and I worked on the survey research design, and we are going to give you some details on what this design looks like. Okay, first we're just going to talk about the definition of survey research. And it says that survey research involves collecting data to test hypotheses or to answer questions about people's opinions on some problem or issue. And this is the definition that comes from our textbook. And at the bottom it says that it examines attitudes, opinions, beliefs, activities, emotions, also changes and trends about an issue. And so many of us are familiar with surveys. It's a very common research method. And in today's world, most of the surveys are done online, through the web, through email, and those things. And we're going to discuss more about survey research and give more details about this method. There are two types of designs for survey research. The first one is cross-sectional, and the second one is longitudinal. So for cross-sectional, it is when the data is collected from selected individuals one time, and it is to gain insight on beliefs or opinions instead of trends or changes. Longitudinal is data that's collected 2 or more times, and it is more for identifying changes or trends. So if you do a one-time survey asking how someone feels about climate change, and they just pick their answers, turn it in, and that's it, that would be cross-sectional. They're just being interviewed one time, they answer their questions, it's about something they believe in or their opinion, and then it's done. Longitudinal is a series of questionnaires, a series of interviews, whatever it may be, to identify changes or trends in something. So that kind of separates the two designs there. Okay, so the types of surveys are questionnaires or interviews. So a questionnaire would be anything that's written, so that could be a paper survey, that could be something that is sent in the surface mail, or it could be even an email. Interview is something that's oral, in person, question to answer. So if you are talking to them face to face, if you're talking to them on the phone, that would be what an interview would look like. There are some characteristics for all survey research designs, and so that looks like this. It's sampling from a population, always, and collecting data through questionnaires or interviews, like we talked about. The construction or identification of survey instrument for data collection, so creating those questionnaires and interviews. And then there has to be a high response rate. Okay, so then we come to sampling, and for sampling, the main thing is that it has to have a high response rate, because for a survey research you are generalizing a lot, and in order to generalize something it has to have a response rate that is higher than 50%, because it won't be able to be a general study if you have something that's lower than 50%. Certain groups are underrepresented and some are overrepresented, so young and old adults, males, people with high incomes, those are all underrepresented usually in a survey research, and people with lower incomes are overrepresented. So that's kind of interesting to look at in sampling. The basic steps of survey research include, first, stating the problem. What is the issue? What is it that we're going to be looking at and gaining opinions about or looking at the trends in? And then the second step is to construct or locate the questionnaire or survey tool. So what are you going to use to conduct this survey? The third is the pilot test. So you want to pilot test your questionnaire, make sure there's no bias happening, and make sure it's not confusing or offensive, any of the questions that you're asking. The fourth thing would be to prepare a cover letter. Fifth, you actually administer your questionnaire. So select your participants, distribute the questionnaire, and then follow-up activities. 6, you would tabulate the questionnaire responses and analyze them, and then write your report. There are some potential challenges in survey research, and like I already mentioned before, it's that response rate. If you don't have higher than 50% response, then you are unable to generalize those results. So you have to have a high response rate that is accurate, unbiased, and true, that they're telling the truth, and in order to generalize those results. And this is definitely the biggest issue. And then non-response is also a problem. So if you're emailing out a survey and they skip certain questions because maybe they're offensive or they're confused by the question, then you are going to have a lot of things that are unanswered, and that's going to affect your research. So it is important to examine your questionnaire during your pilot test, because if there are any biases or confusions in there, you can check that during your pilot test and fix it before you actually do your survey. Another potential challenge, which is kind of what I talked about already, is the bias aspect. So there's over-reporting of admirable attitudes and behaviors, and then there's under-reporting attitudes and behaviors that are not socially respected. So there's things that are positive that are being reported a lot, and then things that are so negative but aren't being reported on enough. So that's kind of another bias situation that's happening with survey research. Examples of survey research. So the first one, of course, is web-based. So we all are familiar with those web-based survey tools like SurveyMonkey and Lime Survey, those things that can be done online. There's also checklists, free response, and then there's scales. So when you see something that says, on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you feel about whatever it may be? And so those are kind of tricky also in accuracy, but that's another story. So, and then there's interviews, face-to-face or telephone, and mail. So you can do emails or just regular surface mail. There's advantages and disadvantages to each type of survey. So for a web-based survey, it is low cost. That's the biggest advantage there. And there's also less time required for both the participants and the researcher. There's no interviewer, so they are more likely to give honest answers. When there's someone in front of you, you might not be as brutally honest with your answers as if you were alone. And then it's also convenient for the responders and for the researchers, honestly. And it's quick and easy to tabulate those results. A disadvantage to web-based survey is that there is no interviewer. So that's both an advantage and a disadvantage, because they may need to be probed for those answers or ask more questions. And you can kind of read body language if you are interviewing in person, so that's definitely a disadvantage. And then limited sampling and respondent availability, getting people to do those web-based surveys and finding people who would be great for your survey. And then there's interview that's face-to-face. Advantages are that you have great response rates. If you're standing in front of someone, asking them questions, you're most likely going to get high response. And then you can also observe attitude and body language. So like I said before, you can kind of feel out what this person is trying to say because of their attitude, their body language. You can probe for more information if they're not answering it fully or they've given you kind of a off-kiltered answer. You can ask them to restate it a different way or explain more. And then also you can record that interview to go back and listen to later to really analyze those results. A disadvantage of interviewing face-to-face is that it's expensive, time-consuming, and it may produce interviewer bias. If you're dealing with those people face-to-face, you can definitely form some bias about them. And then unstructured data analysis. So it can be hard to analyze that data based on those just in-person interviews because it's not as cut and dry as just an online type survey. And then there's interviews on the telephone. So advantages of that is that once again you have a high response rate. You are most likely going to get answers if you're just asking them over the phone. And you can reach a large range of locations and respondents because you're just using the phone method. It can be anonymous, which is great, and it's quick. A disadvantage is that there's no visual. You're not in person it's not a visual in-person interview. So there's no visual materials. And then cell phones versus landlines. You know, a lot of people don't use landlines anymore. Cell phones, do they have, is it going to break up the interview or whatever might happen? And then call screening is common. So are they even going to answer your calls from a random number? And it requires a list of phone numbers. And you have to decide how you're going to get those. How are you going to know that those are good people to interview? Okay, the next way to do an interview or a questionnaire is through mail. And one of the advantages of that is that it's very inexpensive. Also, there's no interviewer, so the respondents can give a more honest answer. They won't feel as intimidated or pressured when answering the questions. It can be anonymous, and it's easy to score. And then a couple disadvantages of mail is that there are lower response rates. It is difficult to get the participants to respond to your questionnaire through mail, especially now in 2018 when we rely a lot on cell phones and internet, email, and those kind of things. It's hard to get those responses through mail. It's also not as effective for lower literacy people if they're having a hard time comprehending what's being asked or even reading what the questions say. That's not very effective. And then also, not having an interviewer can be a disadvantage because you can't further question them. You can't ask them more details about what they answered. Now we move on to the importance of survey research standards. It says that poor reporting guidelines lead to subsequent deficient outcome segments in written summaries of research. So basically it's just saying that if we don't have these standards for research, that our outcomes are not going to be accurate. They're not going to really portray the study. And I really like this quote from one of the articles that we looked at. It says, "There's limited guidance and no consensus regarding the optimal reporting of survey research. As in other areas of research, poor reporting compromises both transparency and reliability, which are fundamental tenets of research." So obviously, we cannot have poor reporting in research because of that transparency and reliability of the study. And so these standards just make it to where the survey is being held to a higher standard and making sure that it is accurate and reliable. Okay, so now we're just going to show you a few examples of surveys, which seems very simple, and I know you're all familiar with them, but it's still something that is nice to have a visual of. So this is an example of a school climate survey, and this is obviously something that is a web feedback. It's just all online, and this is kind of one of the scales. So the first question, teachers listen to me in the school. So then they have to pick something on this scale. But it's nice because the feedback would be pretty quick if they finish this. But going back to those disadvantages, there might be some students who just click through quickly and pick something randomly. So that's one of the downfalls of this kind of survey. Quick feedback, you can get it out to all the students, but they may not answer it honestly. So there's an example of a web-based. And then this is just an example of something that's not education related, but it's a basic market survey questionnaire. So this is something that could be done online, but it looks like this one would be more of a paper questionnaire or something you could ask in person, face-to-face, but it has a lot of personal information. So this is something that might be a mailed questionnaire. Just ask what the sex is of the person, what their age is, their highest level of education, etc. So this is something, like I said, because it's a lot of personal information, that would most likely be mailed. This isn't something that people would be very comfortable just saying in an open interview, face-to-face, or maybe on the phone, but once again, with it being so personal, most likely through mail. For our last example, this is an example of a bias situation on a survey. So the first question, question 28, says, "Are you in favor or against Heathrow expanding?" So they're supposed to choose if they're in favor, against it, or if they don't know. But then when you go to 29, it says, "If you knew that Heathrow would definitely close without expansion, are you in favor or against it expanding?" And so that completely invalidates the first question there, because of course someone's going to say, "Oh, well, I don't want it to close, so I'm in favor of it," and then changed their answer to 28 if they weren't sure, if they didn't know what was going on. So this is an example of a bias. This is just way too much detail given to the participant and an obvious bias situation. The last page is just our references, and we used our textbook for this class as our first reference, and then we used 3 articles. And I just wanted to point out the third reference down by Krosnick is really, really interesting, actually. It's an older article. It's from 1999, but it just covers survey research as a whole, and it was really informative, and we got a lot of information from that. So I hope that you enjoyed this video and that you learned a lot about the survey research method. Okay, thank you.